Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
OH! Oh, that felt so good. You have no idea how that warms my heart. So, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, Shaker Heights. Oh, Cleveland's in the house, I see. I went to Stanford, but even at Stanford, I never missed a football game. I was up at 9 a.m. At my friend's house watching all the games. I've been there for Ohio State for a while, so it's really good to be back and to be talking on this subject. Now, before we get in too deep, I just want to give you guys a little bit of chance to get to know me a little bit better. I was an undergraduate at Ohio State. I was here from 1999 to 2003, so a few years back. So first thing, maybe we need to compare some differences between my experience at Ohio State and what you guys might see. So during my time, this was our president. And that's your president. Now, during my time, there were a lot of technological advances, and everyone got an email address. Now, many of you have like 9 email addresses, but for me, having one Hotmail address was plenty. And now you guys have Twitter. I still have no idea what is Twitter for. Seems pointless to me, but whatever. When I was your age, Northwest was a direction. Now apparently Northwest is a person. My, how times have changed. So I want to give you guys a little bit of background, a little more background, and on a serious note about me. So first, I'm married, so that's my lovely wife, and clearly I married up. Next, I'm a dad. Oh yeah. That's my youngest son, Simeon. He's not crying, he's just doing H. Now notice in this picture, only one person went to Ohio State, that's me. So my fanhood is infective. I'm a brother. Well, maybe a brother. I have brothers. Some of you look very scared, like, oh my gosh, he's a Black Panther. No, these are my 2 brothers, Caesar and Clinton, also OSU alums. Matter of fact, all of my siblings, my older sister and both of my younger brothers have OSU degrees. So I think it might be informative for me to talk a little bit about how I became a professor. So some of you might feel like there's this big gap between me and you, but actually it's not that large. I used to live in Holleran House over on North Campus. Okay, a few North Campus residents in here. So how do you go from where I was, sitting in your seat roughly 13, 14 years ago to being a professor? So it starts with my brother, but actually, like all good Ohio State stories, it really starts with football. So my younger brother, I can't call him my little brother, I have to call him younger brother because he's larger than me. When I was accepted into Ohio State as a senior in high school, I really had no idea what I wanted to major in. I knew I was going to come to Ohio State, my sister had come here, it seemed like the best place for me, but I really didn't know what I wanted to major in. And my younger brother, as I said, not little brother, younger brother, he was at a football camp here at Ohio State, and this was in early June. And so my father said, you should consider going down with me to pick him up. We lived in Shaker Heights, it's just a 2-hour drive. You should come down to Ohio State and get to know some people, and maybe you can learn something about what you might be interested in studying. And so while I was there, I actually met a woman named Minnie McGee. I'm not sure if Dean McGee is here, but I was interested in learning more about potential options for for obtaining scholarship money in particular. Like many of you, I was worried about financial aid. And one of the things she told me is, well, engineering, there's a lot of money in engineering, which that piqued my interest. Now, mind you, when I walked into our office, I had no idea what engineering was. But she graciously, there was a program called Preface. Oh wow, Preface in the house. All three of y'all. There was a program called Preface that allowed you to get a preview of engineering before taking on the major. And she accepted me right on the spot for this program on a Friday afternoon. The program started on Sunday. So I literally drove back home that day, quit my summer job, told all my friends goodbye prematurely, and turned right back around and came to Ohio State for this Preface engineering program. And that is how I got into engineering. Now, once I got into engineering, I got very involved with an organization here at Ohio State called NSBE, or the National Society of Black Engineers. And this organization really seeks to build community amongst African Americans, really amongst everyone who's interested in studying engineering. And I'll never forget, maybe one of my first meetings on campus, there was a professor who came to speak. That's him, that's Dr. Gregory Washington. He's actually no longer at Ohio State, he's at the University of California, Irvine. But at the time, he gave a talk on academic excellence. He basically, as an undergraduate and graduate student, from his sophomore year all the way through his PhD, he never got less than an A. So basically a 4.0 GPA for roughly 7 to 8 years in a row. So needless to say, he knew a little something about academic achievement. And in the room, he said, if you were in this room and you're considering mechanical engineering, you absolutely need to get to know me. And I don't know if other people in the room took him up on that, but I did. And I was interested in mechanical engineering, and so I started going to his office and learning more about research opportunities. And one day he gave me the opportunity to do some undergraduate research in his laboratory. Once again, I didn't know what research was, but he opened this up to me. Now, right now, these days, a lot of you are doing research, but back then it was still a little bit odd to be an undergraduate and doing research. Now, because of that, I had a lot of awesome experiences and really kind of developed a passion for research, which led me to apply for this NSF Graduate Research Fellowship, which in some ways, like a lot of these other experiences, was really a game changer for me. This fellowship allowed me funding to potentially go wherever I could get accepted. And I got accepted to a good number of schools and ultimately decided to go to Stanford. If you ever have the chance to visit, it's just, it's an amazing place. Those are some spoiled kids out there. But because of Dr. Washington's mentorship, which I encountered through NSBE, because I had been in the Preface program, because I had met Minnie McGee, because my younger brother played football, I was able to go to Stanford and pursue graduate school. Now, one thing you'll notice in this slide, there are people everywhere, because people are important in your journey. And the next person that became critical in my journey was my PhD advisor. That's him, that's Juan Santiago. And he really allowed me the freedom to work on problems that I found interesting and to really become an expert. I had never become expert in anything. Obtaining a PhD is really about finding the frontier of knowledge in a given field and then pushing that boundary. And my PhD advisor had a strong influence on me in that area. Now, interestingly, after I arrived at Stanford, he gave me the option to work on a project. I was interested in working on something either related to microscale engineering or related to energy. And interestingly, he had recently gotten some funding from Honda. So that's a picture of a Honda fuel cell. Honda was interested in devising ways of making their fuel cells more efficient. And he wanted to do so using these microfluidic pumps. So effectively, I got to marry both of these interests that I had, this interest in microscale engineering and this interest in alternative energy technologies. Now, because of that, I ultimately was able to achieve a PhD at Stanford. And having that PhD at Stanford led me to become a faculty member at MIT. So what is the moral of this story? People ask, how do you become a professor at MIT? I have no idea. It's been a very much a winding journey, and my faith has played a huge role in that. But I couldn't have planned when my brother came here roughly 15 years ago, for a football camp, that my decision to step on campus that day would ultimately lead me into engineering and all the way down the path to being where I am today. So next thing, well, why become a professor? So the first thing is freedom. So that's a picture from Amistad. I guess this is a little bit before your time. But Amistad was a movie about slavery. But freedom, as an academic, you have a tremendous amount of freedom to do whatever you'd like. Really, the ability to get a PhD gives you license to work on a great deal of problems, and I love the freedom that I get from being an academic. Next, intellectual engagement. Being a professor is a lot of things, but none of them are boring. It's very engaging to be an academic and to really pursue the frontiers of knowledge, and that was very attractive to me after I obtained my PhD. Next is lifestyle. So as a professor, you don't really sit around looking at the clock like these four individuals. You have a lot going on, and it's a very exciting lifestyle, and you have a lot of freedom at the same time. So I can do my work from here. I can come to Columbus, Ohio, and speak to you about my interests while also working with my graduate students, and there's just so much flexibility that being a professor is hard to beat. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about cash. Right? So, professors actually make a decent amount of money, not a lot of money, maybe it's a little smaller. But I think there's a perception that being an academic, you're going to struggle, and that's not really the case at all. So, next question, what do I work on? So I'm a professor. Josh, thanks for the introduction. But I'd like to give just give me 5 minutes just to geek out just a little bit and talk a little bit about what I work on at MIT. So here's one example. One of the things my group looks at is we look at how droplets impact surfaces, right? So any of you have ever been outside in the rain, like earlier today, you may have noticed that when a droplet of water hits a surface, there's a splashing and other kinds of dynamic events. My group looks at how droplets impact surfaces that are porous, like paper, like soils. Interestingly, for the engineers in the room, we've actually derived a new dimensionless group. Now, we don't call it the Buie number, we gave it a new number, but we've derived a dimensionless group that helps us characterize how droplets impact on porous surfaces. Something else we looked at, this is a very long name, dielectrophoretic phenotyping of bacteria. Really what you need to take away from this is we use electrical properties of cells to obtain physical information. So phenotypes are the physical information of cells. So if any of you have ever been to the doctor and you get a physical, they're effectively getting your phenotype. So your height, your weight, your blood pressure, your temperature, these are all physically observable properties which can be known as your phenotype. Now the issue with bacteria or single-celled organisms is that it's difficult to make a physical for such a small organism. And so my group has developed microfluidic tools that allow us to get physical properties from cells. Now this is interesting because we can actually do this in some cases with better resolution than some state-of-the-art genetic tests. So there are genetic tests that will tell you two cells are exactly the same, and some of our physical measurements will tell you no, they're actually different. This one will cause disease, and this one won't. And so that's another part of the work that I've been doing at MIT. And then lastly, we have some work in the area of energy storage. So some of you may have heard or may be familiar with the issue of energy storage. Really, the issue comes from the fact that if we want to have renewables, so some of you may even have come from homes where you had a solar cell on the roof. The problem with many renewables, such as solar energy and wind, is that you can't determine when the sun will shine or when the wind will blow. And so you only get electricity during those events. But what if you don't need electricity during those times? What happens to that extra electricity? Right now, it just goes back to the grid. But if we're ever to have wide-scale implementation of these renewable technologies, our grid simply cannot handle the intermittent nature of these renewable sources. So what you need is you need storage so that you could actually store this energy and use it when you need it, and not waste the electricity that you get from wind or from solar. And so my group has developed a new type of energy storage system that has roughly an order of magnitude or a factor of 10 higher power density than other comparable technologies that are being explored. And so this is something that we're looking at potentially commercializing, but it's coming out of my group at MIT. So that's a little bit of background about me, but you guys, maybe you're interested in that. Some of you were falling asleep, I saw you. But I'd like to talk really about, I want to talk about faith. So biggest question we need to get at is, what is faith? So is it possible, and I know some of you might have this question, and that's probably why you're here, is it possible to truly practice science while also holding on to faith in God? You might be wondering, how does an engineer at a place like MIT, such as myself, become a Christian? Another question you might have is, aren't the scientific method and religious faith actually opposed to one another? So I would argue that science and faith are not in opposition. In fact, they're intricately linked. To illustrate my point, I'm going to first try to simply define what faith is and what faith is not, so that we're on the same page. Next, what I'd like to do is talk about how faith has been present at the frontier of science all throughout history. I would argue that if you're going to be a tremendous scientist, you need faith. So it's not something that where these things are just in happy coexistence. You actually need faith in order to be an outstanding scientist. And I'll give a couple examples of that. And finally, I'm going to discuss my own faith and how I believe, just like many other things you might test in science, you can actually test your faith. So first question, what is faith? If we're going to talk about faith, we have to first get on the same page and come up with a working definition. Now, if you're like me, what's the first thing you check when you get into a new subject? Google. Google is our brains for many of us. So I bet there's some of you that did this to me. Now, if you do a Google search on me, this is what comes up. I'm surprised to find that my Harlem Shake video is not actually at the top. It's my lab. But I don't know how they come up with their algorithm. So now, interestingly, just like Gangnam Style and Honey Boo Boo and Harlem Shake videos, Faith actually has a Wikipedia page. So here's Faith's Wikipedia page. And now, according to Wikipedia, faith is confidence or trust in a person or thing, or a deity, or in the doctrines or teachings of a religion. It may also be belief that is not based on proof. Now, you'll notice here that faith is firstly a trust in a person or a thing. Now, you may not think that you have faith if you don't believe in God. But in fact, all of us exercise faith every day from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to bed at night. Now, I'm a parent of 2 young kids. And when you become a parent, you develop all these types of beliefs about how to raise children that are really difficult to test. But you have to do something because your kids are there and you have to nurture them. So I was speaking to a friend of mine one day about his son, and he told me, you know, Cullen, our son is in a great new school. We really love it. It helps to bring out a child's creativity. So intrigued, I asked him, well, how do they do that? He said, for example, they have a rule that children are not allowed to play with single-use toys at home because they stifle a kid's creativity. So rather than giving them a remote-controlled car, which you can only use one thing, you might give him a stick, which he can use for many things, such as whacking his younger brother or poking himself in the eye. So I thought to myself, that's kind of weird, but at least it's cheaper. I could just see Christmas at this kid's house. He comes downstairs and he's all excited and he unwraps up the paper. Ooh, a rock! And who needs an Xbox One? Now I thought about it a little bit more and I began to wonder about all the single-use toys that this kid would miss out on. Can he never ride a bike? I guess not. You only use a bike to mask how slow you run. Now what about video games? Now, there's only one controller, but with that one device, you could be LeBron James in NBA 2K, a sniper in Call of Duty, or an enterprising young hustler. And then I asked the question, well, what about a swimming pool? Is he forbidden from getting into the pool? And that would be a sad life. Well, actually, the pool is probably okay because for a young boy, pools are dual use. Both recreation and restroom. Now, there's really no way that my friend knows without a doubt that this is what's best for his son, but he believes this parenting method will work, and that belief is rooted in faith. So what is faith? My definition is that faith is belief in a person or thing, not with no evidence, but with incomplete evidence. Belief in a person or thing with incomplete evidence. Now, some of the most important decisions you'll ever make in life, you will make based on faith, or in other words, with incomplete evidence. Now, in fact, people exercising enormous amounts of faith have made some of the greatest achievements in the history of science. Now, as you know, and as I've said, I'm a professor at a university. So my job really involves two major fronts. One is teaching and one is research. The teaching aspect of my job requires me to convey to students what is already known in textbooks. The research aspects of my work require me to discover and interpret what hasn't been shown before, or what was previously unknown. So then the question becomes, how does one go about conducting scientific research? It often starts with a hypothesis or an idea that is first taken on, you guessed it, faith. If every proposal I ever wrote was guaranteed to succeed, they would never get funded, because that wouldn't be risky enough. If every device my group ever tried to make was guaranteed to work, that would be simply derivative. There'd be no advance in my research if everything I did I knew was going to succeed, because that, in effect, would be the known knowledge. Now, this is the nature of scientific research. You take a risk on an idea with some information suggesting it will work, but not complete information. The very best research scientists exercise enormous amounts of faith every single day, and this is, in fact, what makes them the best research scientists. So I'll give you a couple examples. So the first involves my very own PhD. When I entered graduate school, I was tasked with designing a new type of fuel cell that incorporated special pumps. Now, fuel cells work by converting chemical energy in a fuel directly into electricity, waste heat, and water. Now, you can think of fuel cells as a sort of hybrid between a combustion engine and a battery. Like a combustion engine, as long as you continually flow fuel, the fuel cell will continue to work. But like a battery, it takes that fuel and converts it directly to electrical energy rather than going through a combustion process. Now, the issue with many fuel cell systems is that there's a delicate balance between the amount of water necessary for the reactions to proceed efficiently and the amount of water that you actually generate or produce in the fuel cell, which leads to a situation known as flooding. Now, fuel cell flooding lowers energy conversion efficiency and is generally bad for the system. Now, as a PhD student, I was tasked with using these special pumps that actually have no moving parts to remove the liquid water from fuel cells. Now, this seemed like a great idea, however, it was very difficult to implement in practice. In principle, we knew that if we could incorporate these pumps, we would absolutely have a better system. But it wasn't exactly clear how you would put this system together. Now, before I began working on the project, there were actually two people who already had PhDs who had attempted to make the new fuel cell work also. They were unsuccessful and had moved on to other work. In fact, one of them actually told me that he believed this project would never work. Oh, ye of little faith. Nevertheless, I decided to produce and work on the project anyways. Though I knew it would be difficult, I believed that I could get it done. You could say that I had faith. After roughly a year of work, including several all-nighters and many frustrating moments, I was able to build this special fuel cell system. This is an image of the system, and this is an image of this special pump. These pumps actually work by using a principle of the surface. So if you allow me to geek out for just one more minute. So glass, if you take glass and you put it in contact with water, glass actually acts like an acid and will donate a proton to that water. So if you had a glass of water that was actually in a glass, there's actually a charged layer on the surface of that glass. Now, due to the potential of that charged layer, it actually draws positive ions from the liquid solution close to it. Because of this, if you were to apply an electric potential or a force on those charges, you can make those charges move that are very close to the surface. If you do this in a channel that's very small, so let's say on the order of 100 microns, for scale, 100 microns is roughly the width of your hair. So if you make a channel with pipes the width of your hair and put water in them, you can actually pump liquid through that channel. That's exactly what this pump does. So this fuel cell was in fact significantly better than comparable designs that didn't include our special pump. Now, along the way, there were several times that I wanted to quit, but something kept me going. That thing was faith, that I would ultimately make this experiment work. This is the type of faith that you find at the frontier of every scientific endeavor. Now, another example of faith in science and technology is the story of Thomas Edison. Some of you might be familiar, but let's talk about it for a minute. In particular, Thomas Edison and his invention of the incandescent light bulb. So here's an image of Thomas Jefferson. Now, actually, the story begins well before Edison, because several, did I say Jefferson earlier? You guys just let me keep going, too. Like, Thomas Jefferson invented the light bulb. Thomas Edison. Okay. So actually, the story begins well before Edison, because several other people had invented light bulbs decades before him. However, Edison sought to create a low-cost incandescent bulb that could make gas lamps obsolete. Now, others had tried to do this before, but their designs were fraught with difficulties and didn't last very long. And they were also quite expensive. Now, Edison was so sure of himself that he actually made proclamations to the media claiming the end of gas lighting was at hand long before he had ever actually done it. Now, unfortunately for him, nearly 2 years passed after his proclamation and he still did not have a better light bulb. So his many critics began to rise up and chastise him, publicly denouncing him as a fraud, a pseudoscientist, and a con artist. In spite of this adversity, Edison and his team pressed forward. One of the key components missing in Edison's design was the proper filament material to allow a glow discharge without incinerating. Over several months, Edison and his team tested over 6,000 different filament materials until they found a suitable carbon material. Then in 1881 at the Paris exhibition, Edison unveiled his new light bulb. The demonstration was a huge success and proved most of his critics incorrect. Now you have to imagine that along the way, Edison and his team became discouraged. He surely must have wondered if his idea would ever work at all. Everyone else did. Yet he continued to work towards his goal in spite of the challenges and risks. He didn't have all the information suggesting that it would work, but he had something inside that kept him going. That thing was faith. Now, a modern day example of persistence in the discovery of, or in a scientific discovery is the recent discovery of the Higgs boson. Now, this particle was postulated by several scientists, including Peter Higgs, who recently won the Nobel Prize. And they had alluded that, but this particle had eluded particle physicists for nearly 50 years. Yet, the community believed that with the right equipment, they could find it. So that equipment is shown here. That's the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. This was a roughly $10 billion project. Finally, with the development of this project, they felt that they had the right tools to finally determine if the Higgs boson actually existed. Now, recently, the Higgs boson was detected by 2 different groups searching for it, answering certain questions in physics while eliciting many more. Now, hearing the sum of this, $10 billion, you have to ask yourselves, why would a community of scientists spend 5 decades and all of that money in search of a particle whose only evidence was theoretical and mathematical? That thing is faith. Perhaps it was faith in themselves or faith in the theory, but it was faith nonetheless. Now, if you still don't believe me, there's one more person who has something to say about faith. Lord Voldemort. Now, I'm not sure how many of you watched it, surely some of you. Now, towards the end of the final Harry Potter movie, when everyone thinks the chosen one, Harry Potter, is dead. Now, I'm not even going to get into the illusions of a story about a chosen one who dies for his friends and then is resurrected. I'm not going to get into all that. But anyways, Voldemort tells Ginny Weasley, Harry Potter is dead. From this day forth, you put your faith in me. Now, notice that he does not question the existence of faith, just where you put it. So interestingly, if Voldemort believes in faith, perhaps it's something we should consider as well. I mean, who can argue with the Dark Lord? So now, why do I bring up these stories? I bring up these stories because some would have you think that faith and reason are incompatible like oil and water. This simply isn't the case. Some of the greatest minds in history have employed faith to advance the frontiers of science, and many of them also had faith in God. Examples include Max Planck, a pioneer in quantum mechanics, George Lemaitre, who first proposed the Big Bang Theory, and Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project and is now the director of NIH. And if you came over to MIT, now you should wait till it stops snowing, but if you came over to MIT, I could introduce you to a whole cadre of professors who have their faith not just in science, but firmly placed in Jesus. Now, the faith that you put in people is close to what I mean when I say I have faith in Jesus. This is similar to the faith that I have in my wife. I can't prove to you without a doubt that she is trustworthy. Nobody can actually do that. But I know her well enough to place a lot of trust in her and to believe that she's worth sharing my life with. If I waited until I believed I had all the evidence, I never would have gotten married. Everyone here is familiar with this type of faith. It's necessary for nearly all of our close relationships. Now we're going to take a quick interlude because I want to talk to just the women in the audience. So this is some free advice on relationship for the young ladies from Dr. Buie. So if you're dating a guy and you think he's the one, but he says he can't even think about marriage right now, run. Run fast. Run like you have 4 legs. If he can't even conceptualize marriage, that means he hasn't met the one yet. He's already met you. That means you aren't the one. I'm sorry to hurt your feelings. Sorry to hurt your feelings. The truth can hurt. I know there's some guy in here like, man, you're messing up my game, brother. Now here's a little secret for you. Now, women, early on, many of you think about marriage from a much younger age than men. Here's the secret. Men don't think about marriage, men think about women. That's actually not that big of a secret. Now, when a man meets the woman that makes him forget about all the other women, he'll do whatever he wants to be with that woman, including buy a wedding ring. So if he's not thinking about marriage, it's because he's not actually thinking about you. You deserve better. Now, I'll make one more small analogy, and I'll use a couple of restaurants in the area. Now, what do you want to be in his life? You want to be his Bob Evans, right? You want to be his Bob Evans. You see, he'll go to Bob Evans all day long. You go to Bob Evans for breakfast, you go to Bob Evans for lunch, you go to Bob Evans for dinner. At graduation, you take your mom to Bob Evans. The problem is, he's treating you like White Castle. Now, when do you go to White Castle? It's only very late at night, after a couple beers. So here's the thing, don't let him treat you like that. You don't deserve that, you deserve better. You deserve to be like Bob Evans. Next time he calls you late at night, this is what you tell him. Sorry, sir, the drive-thru is closed. Hang up the phone. So take my advice, you should be putting your faith elsewhere. So why do I bring up these stories? To be serious, we don't live in a world where some people employ faith and others do not. We actually live in a world where everyone employs faith. The bigger question is not, do you have faith? The question is, where is your faith? So faith is not something that's purely a construct of religion. It's something all of us need to live our daily lives. Without faith, it would be impossible to make it through life. Whether you've thought about it or not, you have faith in a number of things. Perhaps you have faith in the U.S. government. Maybe you should watch what you say on your cell phone, though. Maybe you have faith in the goodness of humanity, or perhaps you have faith that science will one day eradicate all of the world's major ills. Now, it's possible that you've never thought about these things, and you really have no idea where you put your faith. If you're curious to find out, my suggestion is you just follow your hopes and follow your fears. Those are the clues to where you actually place your faith. Is your biggest hope to get a good job? You go to Ohio State, so you're probably in good shape. But if that's your biggest hope, perhaps your faith is in money. Is your biggest fear to be alone? Then maybe you place your faith in human relationships. Now, I suggest you identify where your faith is and test it, just like you would any scientific hypothesis or theory. How else would you know whether or not your faith is in the right place? So then the pertinent question becomes, exactly how do you test your faith? Thankfully, life provides all the tests that you'll ever need. This world is full of challenges and setbacks. The question is, can your faith handle all of them? There are some forms of faith that are adequate in good times or in a small subset of life circumstances, but they can't handle everything. Every time you encounter a new challenge, you should ask yourself, how does my worldview or my faith account for this? Does your faith provide adequate answers to all the questions in your mind and on your heart? If not, perhaps you need faith in something else. So as I've already said, my faith lies in Jesus Christ. However, it wasn't always there. In fact, when I was growing up, it wasn't there at all. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My home was more of a sort where we were exploring, and there was belief in God in general, but there was no adherence to any organized religion. But when I was a freshman here at Ohio State, as I said earlier, I was living in Holleran House, and I had a roommate who was a Christian. And when I saw his life and the difference between his life and the average freshman at Ohio State, I was compelled to explore Christianity more. This is what led me to faith. Now, the interesting thing about this faith is that just because I made a decision 13, 14 years ago, doesn't mean that my faith hasn't been tested. It has surely been tested. The most recent and most vivid began on June 10th, 2010. It was a Thursday. I was in California for a business trip, and I was excited to visit old friends from my graduate school days at Stanford University. Then at around 2 p.m., I received a call from my brother-in-law. This was odd to me because though we were on good terms, he rarely ever called me to talk. However, I learned that this was a special circumstance. He was calling to tell me that my sister, shown here, that's my sister, that's me, that's my sister, and her husband. He was calling to tell me that my sister, a 35-year-old mother of 2 young boys, had suddenly and inexplicably passed away. She went to the hospital in pain earlier that day, and before the doctors could even figure out what was wrong, she was dead. The autopsy showed that she had infective endocarditis, which is a condition in which bacteria in your body actually clot with your blood platelets and form dangerous vegetations that can ultimately lead to sepsis. Now, if any of you know anything about sepsis, it's very deadly. Roughly 30 to 80% of the people who get sepsis, even in the United States, die from this condition. Now, there was no notice. This wasn't cancer. Remember, I just got a call at the end of the day saying what had happened. There was no warning. I never even had the chance to say goodbye. Now, it's easy to say that your faith is in anything, in Jesus Christ, wherever your faith is, when things are going well. What do you do when things aren't going your way? What do you do when you have to call your parents, like I had to do, to tell them that their firstborn child, their daughter, was dead? The next few weeks and months were some of the toughest of my life. My wife and I were expecting a baby, but I couldn't get over the fact that he would never meet his aunt. If God is loving, why does he allow tragedies like this? Was this punishment for something I'd done or for the way that I'd lived? Now, death is the most natural process that we will ever experience. The mortality rate is 100%. We all know we're going to die and see others die, yet it still feels quite unnatural. Why did this happen? Now, I spent many nights in tears asking this and other related questions. Now, I have to confess that even after 3.5 years, I've never received an answer to any of my why questions. Now, what I have gotten has been something better. All the questions I had about my sister and her death really boiled down to just one. God, how can I believe you love me if you'd allow so much pain? The answer is that through Jesus, I have a God that endured pain. Jesus came and suffered so that my sister wouldn't have to suffer alone. Jesus came and died so my sister wouldn't have to die alone. On the cross, interestingly, Jesus cried out to God, "Why have you forsaken me?" If you notice, if you read in that passage, there's no answer given. That's because the answer is in this room. The answer is you and me. We're the reason why. Through Jesus' death and resurrection, we have the opportunity for fellowship with God. God's Son was treated like a sinner so that sinners like me could be treated like sons. How could I resist a God like that? What's not to love? I'm assured that God loves me partially because he suffered with me. If you think about it, this is the way you're ensured in all of your close relationships. Can you think of anyone who you're very close to who has not suffered with you? Your parents, your siblings, your friends? If your love is deep, you've suffered together. I still don't have an answer to the questions of why my sister died, but what I have is much better. I know why not. It's not because I'm not loved. Now, after this experience with my sister, I realized that faith in Christ can answer all of life's toughest questions. And as an engineer, I began to think, well, if it can answer life's toughest questions, perhaps it covers all the easier ones too. My question to you is this: wherever your faith is, does it address all of life's circumstances? I suggest you test it and find out. Thank you.
So much, Cullen, for your sharing and just for your thoughts about faith. And something that I think really struck me when you were sharing was the idea that you grew up in a household where your parents were very open to this idea of exploring faith, right? And then you happen to have a Christian roommate, right? Do you think that given that you had this environment, that if you had not met a Christian roommate, do you think that you would have had a different faith, or do you think that you would have still became a Christian?
Well, as a Christian, I believe my steps in life have been ordered. Now, I had that Christian roommate in college, and that was ultimately the thing that led to me coming to Christ. But I had known Christians all throughout my life. Interestingly, I had a very good friend in high school who I played basketball with, and his mom was particularly devout, a devout Christian, and she would always play Christian songs. And I'll never forget, much later on in life, after becoming a Christian, just remembering these songs. I think God had a plan for me that extended well before my time at Ohio State. The time at Ohio State may have been the catalyst that ultimately led to my faith, but it wasn't the only reason. Now, I should mention something. I think one thing that might be implicit in the question is the suggestion that it wasn't really my choice, or that it was kind of the convenient thing to do because there was the environment suggested that I should become a person of faith or believe in Jesus. And this really wasn't the case for me. Actually, when I first, the day I got baptized and gave my life to Christ, I had a very, very difficult fight with someone very close to me in my family who believed that organized religion was, for lack of a better term, for idiots. And that's what they called me. And so becoming a Christian was not a convenient thing for the environment around me. And I've stayed a Christian in spite of the inconvenience.
Well, I think, you've obviously shown yourself to have gone after faith in a very intentional way, right? But at the same time, we find people who have maybe explored the same evidence that you have, right? And have come to very different conclusions. So for example, well-known atheist Richard Dawkins once said that, he has looked at the facts of Christianity. Can you guys put the quote up from Richard Dawkins? Right, so he has looked at the Bible, he's looked at the evidence, and he just finds that he can't accept it. So how would you say, or what would you say to someone who has looked at the evidence, tried to use the scientific method to try and test faith and come to a different conclusion than you?
Yeah, so I think sometimes there's this impression that I deliberately in my talk about testing your faith, because I think there's the thought that, well, if you're a Christian, you kind of taken your faith and you haven't done any analysis of it. And that's, for me personally, that's not the case. And I think for a lot of people who are adherent to faith, that's not the case. There's a whole long list of people who have come to faith after considering evidence, such as Francis Cullen, who I mentioned earlier, who was the director of NIH and led the Human Genome Project. Now, if you read the Bible, I think there's a grain of truth in what he's saying, is that I think there are some people who might see evidence in a holy book and ignore evidence. But I can't speak to all faiths, but at least in Christianity, Jesus explicitly teaches that we should love God with our whole mind, our whole heart, and our whole soul. And I think that checking your mind at the door is actually not authentic Christianity. I think Christ wants us to have our mind engaged. And I've had my mind engaged, and I know there are plenty of others who have done the same.
Actually, bring that up, on the other hand, we have a lot of skeptics of Christianity who would say that, well, Christianity emerged because, it was the Dark Ages and people didn't really understand anything. And they've kind of brought forth science as kind of this answer to a lot of life's questions. So how would you respond to someone, say, like Prestigious, who would say, well, we used to need the Bible, and we used to need God because we didn't understand the world, but now we do, right? And as a scientist, do you see, the more you know about how the world works, do you see less of a need for God or faith in God?
Well, so to answer the second question, I see science as effectively being the language of God. I see mathematics as showing the beauty of God's creation and the order. It seems to me that if you see something that's ordered, someone must have ordered it. Look at your room. If you don't order your room, it doesn't automatically just come together on its own. The laws of physics would suggest otherwise. It's the second law of thermodynamics. That's one piece, but I think another piece, I guess, related to this quote is the suggestion that Christianity was, I can't speak to all religions, but I'll just speak to Christianity. Christianity might have come about as a way to explain the physical world that we couldn't get a grasp on. Now, I believe the evidence actually suggests that Christianity came about because Jesus was a real historical figure who lived and died, and the people that witnessed his resurrection had to change their life based on the truth that they saw. It wasn't a convenient thing to do. 11 of his 12 original disciples were martyred. And so you wouldn't do that simply to explain the weather or things about science. It was brought about because of this truth that they saw because of evidence.
Well, then, how would you answer someone, the people would say, well, inherently science and faith are in conflict, right? So like in your talk today, you've talked about how you see them kind of going together, and in fact, you make the argument that science requires faith, right? But at the same time, we have a lot of people who don't believe that, and who kind of believe that science and faith are in this lot of struggle. How would you answer some of those critics or skeptics?
Yeah, so I think that science and faith they're in conflict for some people, but at their core, I don't think they are. As I mentioned earlier, the Bible talking about how we should love God with our heart, our soul, and our mind. I think God really wants our minds engaged. I think that the work that I do as a scientist actually gives God glory, to uncover things about the physical universe that reveal His beauty. I think it actually enhances my faith. Conversely, I think that there's in some ways, there's maybe a little bit of arrogance in the scientific community to believe that science answers all the questions that you need to know. I gave the example earlier of my wife that I wouldn't get married if I waited for all the scientific evidence. But I think all of us know this deep down, that science doesn't necessarily answer all questions. So I'll give one kind of rhetorical question for the audience. So there's some that would believe, they don't believe anything unless it's been scientifically tested. But without showing hands, but just think about it. Have you ever gotten a DNA test to show that your parents are who they say they are? Now think about that for a minute. You could actually do it. There's nothing stopping you. I'm not sure how you're going to collect the DNA from your parents, but if you're a person that believes you need evidence to in order before you'll have faith or believe in anything, then why not get the evidence for your parents? Like, you could actually get the scientific evidence that they are who they say they are. How do you know you weren't adopted? Like, you have pictures, but that doesn't mean you weren't adopted. How do you know you weren't the product of marital infidelity? Just because you were born to your mother doesn't mean that's your dad. You can actually get the scientific evidence, but why are you not pursuing it? It's because you have other evidence that is more important to your heart. You know how much they love you. You know how much they care for you. You trust them. And in that case, the scientific evidence doesn't even matter to you. And you're willing to accept on faith that they're your parents. So I guess in some ways I'm requesting or asking people to, okay, if you're going to be a scientist in everything. And find out who your parents are.
So in your own faith journey, how did you decide because obviously we can't be testing everything all the time, right? Like, we could never survive, we couldn't get off the stage, we would just live in fear. How would you, in your faith journey, how did you decide, I now know enough about God that I'm going to take it as if it's true?
Yeah, so I think for me, it started with an experience. So I'll be 100% honest. It didn't start with an intellectual search for truth. It started with seeing truth in the life of my roommate. It started with seeing his life and seeing the evidence of that and saying, this life is different than all the others. Right? I'm watching how he lives, and I'm watching how the average 18-year-old lived, and it was distinctly different, and it was attractive to me. And that was the truth that originally drew me in. But to be honest, it didn't take very long to get into the Bible and find things that were difficult to understand or difficult to know. One of the places I first went, I read Lee Strobel's A Case for Christ, very early in Christianity, because I wanted some evidence. It didn't seem to me like I should just believe this just because my roommate seemed like he was a good person. I wanted to see if there was, more historical or physical evidence, and there's actually a great deal of it.
And you find yourself updating your confidence in your faith over time, or how do you go about that process of trying to be like, okay, maybe before I was 75% confident, tomorrow or next year I would be 80% confident?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I like that term of updating. I guess you could say in some ways I'm always downloading the next best app for my faith. Um, and very recently I'm reading a book on Genesis and the Big Bang. This is a question that's been in popular culture for the last couple of years. It's made even more popular with the debate very recently. And I think that a lot of us are, searching for truth in this on both sides of the argument. And I would say, as I've searched for evidence, I probably went from 75% sure to I'm very sure now. The more evidence that I've looked at, I've only become more sure.
Okay, cool. Already from the audience that I think, Cullen, I think it would be a great question for him to talk about. Again, please fill out the comment cards. Remember, we're not going to spam you. You might win an iPad. I have not seen the iPad, but I have faith that the iPad exists. So, there. So one of the questions we had, Dr. B, was this idea about updating, right? And so we've kind of had this implicit assumption that, that as you find more evidence, that you'll be updating greater confidence about your faith in God and your faith in Jesus Christ. Would there ever be evidence that you could find that could undermine your faith in Jesus?
Yeah, I think there could be. I'm sure there could be evidence that would undermine. I think one of the first things that I looked at after becoming a Christian was, well, can we trust the Bible? Can we trust the Gospels in particular, or the writings of the Apostle Paul? And the search that I've done suggests that you absolutely can. In particular, with Paul's writings, it's been shown that these writings were done during the lifetime of people that would have witnessed the events that Paul says happened, including the death, resurrection of Jesus. And so, and some of which were roughly, within 20 years of these events. So you could imagine, let's say today, who was president 20 years ago? So 20 years ago, I guess that would have been Bill Clinton, right? Who I showed earlier. And so you couldn't make up a story right now about Bill Clinton because there are people alive who actually witnessed it. So to suggest that Paul may have made up a story about Christ when there were people still alive, I think those stories would have been refuted if they were untrue. Now conversely, if evidence like this didn't exist, if it came out that people said actually these writings were actually hundreds of years later or they were fabricated, as some people have suggested, people have suggested those things, but the leading scholarship says no, these were actually very close to his life. So if there was some undermining of the text, I think that would be evidence that would shake my faith. Other evidence quickly might be if you could definitively, show me Jesus' bones, if you could show me his body, or cremated body in a bottle or something, I don't know. Some evidence that no, he wasn't actually resurrected. He did live, but he was just a regular dude. If that was the case, then it's not worth following all the stuff that's said.
Cool. Well, I think we actually have a video now, so let's have that question from the video.
And I'd also would like to know how his peers, their opinion on his faith and how that's been met with those around him.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I think for people in science, I know some of you are here because you saw MIT professor in faith. You're like, oh, that doesn't make no sense. I think there's this assumption that someone working in science or engineering, particularly at a place like MIT, there's no way you could believe the things of the Bible. Now, I've actually found 99.5% of my colleagues are extremely open to discussions about faith. Even if they're sure in their own beliefs, they don't categorically dismiss me as a person because I have beliefs that are different. And I think part of that comes from having a relationship. There could be a way, if I conducted myself in a certain way, that might come off as abrasive, that might be less favorable. In that case, maybe it'd be different, but all the conversations that I've had with colleagues have been positive. And that doesn't mean they all agree with me, but I don't think there hasn't been a major issue there.
Okay, so speaking about questions that other scientists might ask you, right? So you had mentioned earlier today, you kind of referenced the big debate a week ago between Bill Nye the Science Guy and Ken Ham on the 6-day creation story. We know that you're not a evolution biologist, but you're a scientist. So how would you answer people's question that says, I can't believe the Genesis account, or I can't believe that a 6-day creation was true?
Yes, this is a great question. When I first came to the Bible as a new Christian at Ohio State, this question vexed me, and this was the main source of my doubt. Actually, I was sure in the Gospels, and I believed in Jesus. But when I looked at the account in Genesis, I could not. It didn't reconcile with what I thought I knew about the world and about the universe. Until I heard some people, other thinkers on this issue. I think one thing to note is that Christians aren't a homogeneous set on the events of creation. There's actually a good deal of debate. You could have a debate on creation within the Christian community, much less within and without the community. And I began reading and hearing of people who suggested that maybe Genesis 1 wasn't necessarily meant to be taken literally. And when you look at it, it's very poetic. And God said, "Let there be evening and morning, the first day, and it was good." And God said, "Let there be, and it was good, evening and morning." That sounds a lot like a song. Songs have a lot of repetition. One of my favorite songs has a lot of repetition. "We don't really care for the whole state of Michigan." The whole state of Michigan. The whole state of Michigan. Like, why do they say that over and over again? Didn't you get it the first time? But the point of that song is, if you press that song for the question of, well, how do you do that? How do you not care for the entire state, even the dirt, even the grass? Is there no one from Michigan that you care for? I'm not going to answer that. But really, the point of that song is the message behind it. And I think the point of Genesis is not to press on how the world was created, but why and who.
To stay in Genesis for a moment, another important thing that comes up in Genesis is the idea of sin, right? So in Genesis 1, we have the idea, or in the first couple chapters of Genesis, sin entered this world. And so how do you reconcile the concept of sin and the idea that if God was loving and powerful, why couldn't he just wipe it away?
Yeah, this is another thing I've wrestled with, and in some ways I think it kind of is coupled to the concept of the problem of suffering. Why does God just wipe away suffering? I think to wipe away suffering, he would have to wipe away sin, and to wipe away sin, he would have to wipe away us. We have free will. We are free to do whatever we would like to do. And in actuality, that is the most loving thing that God could do. If you think of any relationship, if you see two people and one person does everything the other person says, you say that's abusive. You say that's oppressive. And we don't have an abusive or oppressive God. We have a God that gives us freedom. We have a God that allows us to do what we would like. And I think that that's actually most loving. We have sin because we have free will. I think a lot of people would love to have sin eradicated, but they also kind of like free will. And so if we're going to live in a world where people are free to do what they want, you're going to have people that, all of us actually, who are occasionally doing things that aren't right.
So you brought up at the end about this idea about, doing the right thing, right? And I think one of the implications you had in your comments today was the idea that your belief in God or your faith in God is the underpinning for your morality, right? Now, many people say, well, we don't need God to be moral. How would you respond to that? That we just need to look at the world and just do the right thing, and, why do we need to reference this supernatural God out there?
Yeah, that's another great question. I mean, I think, interestingly, when you look at a lot of the world's major religions, they actually line up on morality. And I think one of the reasons for that is I think inside of us there's something written that suggests that there is a right and wrong, and that it transcends our individual concepts, but there's a collective. I guess when I think about right and wrong and I think about morality, I think one danger of a world without a God is, well, who is the ultimate judge? Right? Who ultimately gets to say what's right and wrong? Because occasionally you see people and large communities of people that do things that you would say are wrong. Who is the one that puts a check on them? If there is no God, then whoever gets to say what's right and wrong, it really becomes just a power struggle. So I say one thing is right, you say a different thing is right. The person who gets their way is the one with the most power. If there's no absolute arbiter between us. And so how do you tell, for example, how do you tell Nazi Germany that this is wrong? If there is no God? Well, you could say, well, no, but we feel that this is wrong, but no, now you're just exerting your power. You say that, but you're just exerting your power, and now you're going to go to war with them. But who's to say that they aren't wrong? If there is no God or no one outside of us to suggest that that there's a better way to live.
One of your responses actually touches on another question we got, which is the concept of subjectivity, right? So as a scientist, everything you measure is objective, right? You can measure it and you can put a number on it, or you can see it there, right? And so some people claim that, a religion is a subjective experience. There's no objective data for faith, right? Or, if God is out there, why doesn't he give us more objective data, right? And so how would you respond to someone who said that, well, if everything is subjective, then whether or not I believe it's, I don't have an ultimate arbiter to tell me or to give me evidence that I should believe in the Christian Jesus Christ versus some other conception of God?
Yeah, so I guess a couple things in thinking about this. One, I actually do think you can test your faith or you can test your beliefs, or you can test God in the ways that, in some ways, the ways that I've already discussed, of something happens in life. Does your worldview or your conception of God or lack thereof, or agnosticism or whatever the case may be, does your worldview account for this experience? Another way you can test the Bible in particular is the Bible actually has a lot of promises where it says, like, if you do this, this will happen. Such as in the New Testament, Philippians, it says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, present your request to God, and the peace of God that transcends all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So, if you are anxious about something, or if you are looking for the peace of God, or if you're just looking for peace, you can directly test that promise. Are you presenting your request to God earnestly with thanksgiving? And you can test those things. I've tested those things in my life, and I found them to be true. And there's a long litany of others whose experiences they've tested God on these matters and found them to be true as well. Does that kind of get to your question?
I mean, I think, talking about the idea of testing, right, and promises, as you talked about. One of the, perhaps a core promise of Christianity is the idea that if you believe in Jesus, you will go to heaven. The implicit promise, or the implicit premise that if you don't believe in Jesus, you can't go to heaven. Now, for many people today, right, that seems it just doesn't sit right. Like, how is it that, there's only one way to heaven? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. It's a tough question. I mean, I think I heard a joke about this effectively, that if you were in a burning house, and the firefighter comes in and he says, "Follow me. There's only one way out." You wouldn't sit there and say, "Well, I resent you that this is the only way out. I believe there must be multiple ways out." But you don't have the perspective of the fireman who's come in to save you. So how do we know that? You can suggest, well, there's multiple ways, but then you're simply almost doing the same thing that you're maybe railing against. It's saying that your knowledge, you say, well, actually it doesn't matter. Well, that assumes a great deal of knowledge about the universe and about God. And I think, so we can talk about the concepts of heaven and hell as well. And I think there's this perception that God will send people to hell. But if you think about what the Bible says, it says if you are willing to accept a God who's bigger than you, then you will be in the presence of that God. Now, imagine if what the Bible teaches is true and we're all eternal beings. And let's say there's just a hint of selfishness in you. Over the course of 50 years, that selfishness, yeah, that's bad, but maybe not so bad. Now, if you are an eternal being over the course of 50 million years, that selfishness could become like hell. So does God really send you to hell? Or does God let you go where you've already chosen on this side? Once again, you have free will. You chose not to be with him. The Bible teaches that, in his presence is peace and life, and you've chosen otherwise. And so you go where you've already chosen.
Related to that, I think another kind of implicit assumption that we made tonight is the idea that the God of the Bible is real, right? So we can have evidence for the Bible, right? We can have historical records, we can have scrolls that we find in caves. What evidence would you give to someone who says God's not real? Show me, show me proof.
So I think going back to the things I mentioned earlier, particularly with relation to the Bible. So I would suggest to anyone who says they want proof, I would say go to the Bible, particularly to the Gospels, and see what Jesus had to say. Now I should give a caveat, because I think there's a particular way to read the Bible. So I'll give a quick analogy. I'm an engineering professor, and engineering textbooks have physical principles and practical application. And you oftentimes work out your understanding of the physical principles with practical applications through problem sets. Any of you who are engineers know that half of your life is spent working on problem sets and working out different problems. Now, if you just read the textbook and do not work out the problems, you will not learn the material. You will see the concepts. So I teach thermodynamics. You might see the concept of the second law of thermodynamics, but if you never work out any practical problems that actually use it, you will actually never really understand what that book was talking about. I think the Bible is very much the same way. The Bible is not an encyclopedia. The Bible is not a collection of stories that you go to just to make you feel good. The Bible is a workbook. So when you go to the Bible, you need to go in community. You study your P sets in a team. You should be studying the Bible in a team. You study your P sets to work out practical application. You study the Bible, and you have to actually try to work these things out. If you don't go to the Bible like that, you've read it, but you haven't used it properly. So in some ways, you might say, well, the Bible didn't work for me, but did you use it properly? And so I suggest, go to the Bible, but use it the way it was meant. It's always been meant to be done in community and through earnest application. And it's not something that you just read like you would Aesop's fables or something like that.
And so, like you had mentioned earlier on this question of how do I read the Bible, that you say, well, I believe Genesis 1 to be more figurative than a literal. Some people would say then, well, if that's the case, why should I take anything else in the Bible to literal? How would you, I think in your previous answer you had, mentioned briefly how you would go about reading it, but what are the principles that kind of guide you in your search for truth in the Bible?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think that the issue of how the world created is important. It's just not the most important thing on the planet. I think why the world was created is more important. Now that being said, if you look at Genesis, if you look at the creation account, Genesis itself gives at least two different creation accounts, right? Genesis 1 and then in Genesis 2, different things happen. So why would any sane person write a book? Well, you could say, well, they weren't sane. But let's assume that they were sane. Why would you write a book and put contradictory texts right after another? And I think it's because one account is a historical account and one account is a figurative account. This happens in other parts of the Bible where you see perhaps Israel obtains victory over a nation, and then you see a song about their victory over that nation. And I think it's a literary device to give you, the song is there to give you richer meaning, to help you see the feeling of God and his intentions for creating the world more so than how it was done. And so in the particular case of Genesis, the fact that there are different accounts in the same book of the creation suggests that maybe one of them is meant to be literal and one of them is meant to be maybe more figurative. Maybe not totally, but more figurative.
Well, then, like, how does that keep us from saying, well, you know, this is literal, this is figurative, and at some point sliding into everything is figurative?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point. You have to look at, it takes a lot of study. This is back to what I was talking about, studying the Bible in community. There are people that have looked at these issues for centuries. And there are places where you can tell, okay, this was meant to be literal, this is meant to be figurative. Jesus talks about, you know, how difficult it is for a rich man to get into the kingdom of God. Like, it's like a camel going through the eye of the needle. And, you know, when you read that, it's like, well, can a camel go through the eye of a needle? Like, what is he talking about? He's illustrating the fact that it's difficult. So you don't get so caught up in the details of like, how would that thing physically happen? He says like the kingdom of God is like a mustard seed. He says it's something that starts out small that grows to be large. There's a lot of places in the Bible where you're given figurative language to help you unearth a deeper meaning. And my request or my suggestion is to go to people who've studied more than you, or go with peers to the Bible and try to work out some of these issues.
Are there passages in the Bible that maybe you've tried to struggle and you just can't make a sense of, even now?
I'm sure if we went through the Bible, we could come to some. I don't have any off the top of my head, but there's certainly nothing that's such a struggle where it actually has me questioning what I believe. I mean, the Bible is a long book, and there's a lot of things in there that can be difficult for us to accept or to understand. And so, but as you read the Bible more and more, and you start to find areas of the Bible, you have to do this for a long time. So what I'm saying is that, let's say Genesis 1, for example. If you would ask me this very same question 14 years ago, I would have said Genesis 1. I don't understand how the creation account, I don't understand how that can reconcile with modern science. And that would have been a big stumbling block for me. But now, my understanding now, after years of study, is that actually Genesis 1, I'm more confident in Genesis 1 than I was before. And it's that process of sitting with the Bible and stewing over it and having some things that you don't agree with and you don't understand, and then over time realizing, man, I can come to an understanding. You see there are other parts of the text that you perhaps don't understand, but you won't give up on them because you have evidence and you've seen that you can come around to greater understanding with time.
And maybe, since you talked about time, our time is ending soon tonight. So I guess the question is, you know, we've had an hour and a half tonight to kind of begin to grapple with this question of faith, right? And what do you believe in? What advice or insights or guidance would you give to the people out there tonight about how to continue that journey, right? So, I mean, you were where we are a couple years ago, and now that you've kind of gone through it, what would you say to people who are maybe just starting or beginning to explore this faith journey?
Yeah, so I would like to encourage them, first of all. I think that these questions are important. That's the biggest thing that I would want people to get across, is that what you believe about the origins of the universe, why are you here, does your life have a purpose? Does that purpose come from within you, or does it come from outside? These are critically important questions. And I mention that because, you know, you're all college students, and your answers to these questions actually influence your life every day, whether you realize it or not. The decisions that you make, how you interpret life, how you interpret death, whether you think you have a purpose or not, influence how you deal with the various situations you have in front of you in life. And so these are important, so I encourage people to first keep searching. I'd encourage people to go to the Veritas website, where you can see dozens of people with various perspectives on science and faith and Christianity and other belief systems who've also gone through a similar search and come to various conclusions. It can be helpful to see someone else and hear their journey as you're looking for guidance. I certainly encourage people to go to the Bible, particularly the Gospels, as I mentioned, but I caution people to do it in the way that I mentioned. Go like it's a workbook. It's going to give you homework, and do the homework. If you go to the Gospels and do the homework and find that you don't believe it's true, then then I think that, you've gone faithfully and you've really attempted it. Don't go just reading it like you would read any other book. It's not meant to be read like that.
Cool. Well, I want to just thank you guys for coming again, and we hope you have a good night. And once again,
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.